So, I have finished Zadie Smith's new novel, and I have my verdict on The Fraud. Stick around to the end of the video to hear my rating and my ranking, but first let me talk about this new book. I recently put up a video where I ranked all of Zadie Smith's novels, her 5 novels that came out before The Fraud. Check out that video if you haven't watched it already. After I finished all of her books and ranked them, I was really excited to hear that she was coming out with this new novel, The Fraud. As soon as that release date came around, I ran to my local library to see if they had a copy. I couldn't find it on the shelf, so I went and asked the librarian if they had any copies. She told me they hadn't got them in yet, but they had a shipment of multiple copies on the way. She asked if I wanted to be put on the wait list. I said, of course, yes. And she said, okay, no problem. You are number 115 on the waiting list. Yeah, Zadie Smith is famous, and the hype for this novel was real. The librarian was convinced that it wouldn't take that long to get through the waiting list because they had multiple copies on the way and people would read through it quickly. So I spent a month or a month and a half waiting to see if I would get notified that it's my turn, but I got impatient and I wanted to read it before the end of the year, so I did end up buying a hardcover copy of the book. Of course, I did want to have a copy of my own to add to my collection. However, personally, I favor paperback copies, so I was hoping to read a library copy and then wait for the paperback to be released and add that to my collection. Anyway, point being, the hype was real, like I said. And I gotta say, I'm a little bit disappointed. So I'll try to talk about this book without spoiling it. So let me start by first carefully reading the synopsis from the inner flap of the book. It is 1873. Mrs. Eliza Touche is the Scottish housekeeper and cousin by marriage of a once famous novelist, now in decline, William Ainsworth, with whom she has lived for 30 years. Mrs. Touche is a woman of many interests: literature, justice, abolitionism, class, her cousin, his wives, this life and the next. But she is also skeptical. She suspects her cousin of having no talent. His successful friend, Mr. Charles Dickens, of being a bully and a moralist, and England of being a land of facades in which nothing is quite what it seems. Andrew Bogle, meanwhile, grew up enslaved on the Hope Plantation, Jamaica. He knows every lump of sugar comes at a human cost, that the rich deceive the poor, and that people are more easily manipulated than they realize. When Bogle finds himself in London, star witness in a celebrated case of imposture, he knows his future depends on telling the right story. The Tichborne trial, wherein a lower-class butcher from Australia claimed that he was in fact the rightful heir of a sizable estate and title, captivates Mrs. Touche and all of England. Is Sir Roger Tichborne really who he says he is? Or is he a fraud? Mrs. Touche is a woman of the world. Mr. Bogle is no fool. But in a world of hypocrisy and self-deception, deciding what is real proves a complicated task. Based on real historical events, The Fraud is a dazzling novel about truth and fiction, Jamaica and Britain, fraudulence and authenticity, and the mystery of other people. Well, that gets to my main problem with the novel, is that it is not dazzling, like it says here. For me, it might be Zadie Smith's most boring novel. I have a feeling it was probably more fun for Zadie Smith to research this than it is for the reader to actually read it in novel form, because it is an interesting period of time in history. The set of characters and the situations seemed like they would be interesting. I had never heard of William Harrison Ainsworth before hearing about this novel, but he was real, and he was right up there with Charles Dickens in terms of his literary fame and popularity at the time. It's true that he even outsold Charles Dickens in his time with at least one of his novels. However, it seems like he was quickly forgotten by the general public after his death. That's why most people today, myself included, have never heard of William Ainsworth, but I'm sure we've all heard of Charles Dickens. His novels are still super popular, and of course, they make movie adaptations of his books all the time. Obviously, Ainsworth does not have the legacy of Dickens. One of the questions of the book is whether Ainsworth himself was a fraud as a writer, or that his popularity was just kind of a shallow thing at the time, and that's why his work is unimportant in the long run. For parts of this book, while I was reading it, I was thinking that this might be my least favorite of Zadie Smith's novels. At the beginning, it seemed kind of slow, but I kept telling myself, okay, I'm just still getting into the story. It's just introducing characters. It's introducing, the time period, the setting, all of that. But then I realized I'm already 100 pages in, and it still feels like it's just introducing things. Before I know it, I'm 200 pages in, I'm halfway done. It still kind of feels like that, but it does have some engaging sections hidden throughout. I found it actually a pretty quick and easy read, despite how long it is and how I mentioned that it's kind of boring. So I can't say that it's necessarily poorly written. Because of the nature of the court case and different accusations of fraud and the non-chronological storyline, it jumps forward and back in time. It's kind of hard to follow the drama at times. There's rumors and theories swirling around, lots of different characters talking, and then of course we're jumping through time, so it gets a little convoluted. However, those themes of fraudulence and authenticity are interesting, especially how they're explored through the perspective of Mrs. Touchet. Mrs. Touchet is an interesting character overall. Apparently she was also a real person in William Ainsworth's life, and I really liked her perspective in the novel. She has some interesting quotes here and there as well. For example, when Mrs. Touchet says, "If anybody truly understood what is signified by the word person, they would consider 12 lifetimes too brief a spell in which to love a single soul." Very romantic. Interesting idea. So I really liked Mrs. Touchet, and I liked that this novel was from her perspective, as opposed to William Ainsworth, although it is from the perspective of Andrew Bogle for a while, and that part was not my favorite. If anything, I wish there were more of Mrs. Touchet, and I wish that she had done more as a character, maybe been more active in the story. However, she was a real person. Zadie Smith deserves credit for her accurate portrayal of a servant woman in the 19th century. How active could she have been? What else could she have done? Speaking of how the story turns out, without spoiling it, I will say that the climax and resolution were satisfying, given everything that happens in the story before it. So it does build to a nice climax and resolution. I'm being careful not to be too specific. Spoiler free. So the ending saves the novel for me in a sense. The ending can really make or break a book, and it doesn't break it. At the end of reading The Fraud, I do place it towards the bottom of Zadie Smith's novels. Honestly, The Fraud is competing with The Autograph Man for my least favorite of her books. My verdict right now is that The Fraud is a little bit better than The Autograph Man. I give it a 6.5 out of 10. It's all right. I would almost call it good. But after all the hype building up to it, I am disappointed. Of her now 6 novels, that puts The Fraud as number 5 on my ranked list. Have you read it yet? Let me know what you think of Zadie Smith's new novel in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the next book that you read. Bye.